Buenos dias, everybody, and welcome to the Friday night live stream, by which I mean, once again, I forgot to set it up in time, and so by way of trying to make it up to you, I am coming to you from my dining room. And so hopefully this video will serve as a kind of bookend for our week where we've been talking about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now, the Nicomachean Ethics here is a text that has been studied and commented upon and really wrestled with for centuries. And it's something that people come back to, I think, because it is at once both very compelling and also, in other cases, very infuriating. And next week, when we start to talk about Immanuel Kant's ethics, you're going to begin to see how one might get infuriated talking about happiness, eudaimonia, and end up having to come up with a totally different plan for what ethics is supposed to be about. So, given that, here's what we're going to do today. For this video, I'm going to try my best to keep it short. I'm going to give a brief overview of Aristotle once again, and then we're going to follow that up with some discussion of the main critiques of Aristotle that I tried to get to in the last video, but it did cut me off. My apologies once again for that. Some things are just out of your control. And then finally trying to set us up for next week. Oh, actually, no, not saying us up for next week. Next week will set itself up. I'm going to answer a few questions from you, the class. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, the idea that is central to it is the idea that one becomes ethical by practicing ethics, by which he means that human beings practice their character excellence or character virtues. They cultivate these virtues by engaging in virtuous or excellent practices in order to develop habits and dispositions that will lean them more towards the good of what they should do in any given situation. And those situations are by and large relative to the person in that situation and relative to the situation itself. So it's not like the right thing to do in a given situation is found in the material concerns and constraints of that situation itself, or in just how you feel about it. It is, in a very Aristotelian way, the intersection, the interconnection between the material constraints of the situation you find yourself in and your capabilities, where you are at that moment. And so that means that what you're aiming for is a mean relative to yourself and that situation between excess and deficiency. And you do all of this, you cultivate all of this by acting in a way that imitates the phronimos, or the person of practical wisdom. All of this sounds great, right? Okay, ethics is about striving to get better. It's about being in process. It is about being on the way to becoming a better person. And that sounds great. That sounds, like the sort of thing you'd plaster on the wall of your, garage yoga studio or something like that. Next to the dirty weight bench from the 70s that has a Nietzsche quote above it, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," is in fact Nietzsche. We'll get there and we'll maybe try to understand what he means by that. I'll give you this much. It does not mean sick gains. It means something else entirely. When Nietzsche talks about sickness, it's almost entirely moral. just pretend there's a caveat there in which I inform you about all of the reasons why it's not actually moral, that it's biological for weird Nietzschean reasons. But let's brush all that aside. Okay, so Aristotle's ethics have their limitations, right? One of the limitations is that an ethical life, a well-lived life, a life of eudaimonia, requires the right assortment of both internal and external goods. It requires internal goods because we need to cultivate our moral virtues. We need to be able to be people who are able to practice character excellence, right? But it also requires external goods. And these external goods are the materials and time and sort of station in life and in our society that allow us to become virtuous. There's this moment in book 1, I believe. It might be in book 2, I'm trying to remember, where Aristotle says, only like the sons of rich people have the appropriate amount of education and social standing to give them the time, like the leisure time, and the means by which they can become people who live well-lived lives. And he doesn't mean this to say that other people aren't capable of it. It's just that the external goods that go along with them being able to become more virtuous are not present. Now, already we might pause and go, wait, so what you're saying is poor people can't be ethical, which sounds horrific because it sounds like a really classist kind of thing to say. And on the one hand, that kind of aristocratic streak is very common in Aristotle. Unfortunately, you'll get that. But I think it is, in a charitable read, borne out by his observations of society, that he notes something that I think is really important, especially for those of us who are living in the United States and are, members of what we might call Western democracies. And that is that the structure of our society is built in such a way that only certain people are able to have the time, are able to have the sort of cultural pressure, cultural peer pressure, are able to have the material resources to be able to pursue the kind of education that is required in order to cultivate these character excellences. Again, this is me trying to give a charitable read, because otherwise Aristotle's basically saying the poors are wicked, and that's just something I can't get behind. And I'm pretty sure a lot of other people are like, oh, that actually sounds real bad. And the way I want us to think about this is this way. How expensive is a Tesla? How much more expensive are the quote-unquote green option cleaning products, the ethically sourced clothing, the made in America types of products, right? How much more expensive are these than products made elsewhere? It's almost as though, in order to, for lack of a better term, consume ethically, you have to fall into a certain income bracket that lets you do that. But we can step back behind that point and go, okay, But why would you care about that if it doesn't directly affect you, right? Like, if it's not the case that your community is more likely to be found directly next to landfills or Superfund sites, which in the US just means like places where the EPA stores pollution and stuff like that, right? Um, why would you care? Well, because you're in a certain cultural bracket that gives you the pressure to be that kind of good person. And oftentimes we think of it in terms of pure economic exchange, that I earn this income and I feel guilty about this income, therefore I buy these good things. And when we step back and think about that within the framework of living in a society that says only certain people have the external goods and external resources necessary to cultivate and practice the appropriate internal goods, we begin to see what Aristotle is saying. There's a read of this text that is basically saying something along the lines of, your society is messed up if only some of the people in that society can actually be morally excellent. Like, they literally lack the means to cultivate this otherwise. And those of us who are living in, the contemporary Western world are probably going to say, yeah, well, I mean, this is why you have things like public education, and this is why you have things like free libraries and all of that. And all of those ideas didn't exist in Aristotle's day. They're ideas that are derivative of some of the arguments that Aristotle or people who follow in his wake would think about, right? Like, okay, if we really believe in the idea of democracy, then we should believe that all people should have access to information and the ability to study that information. And they should be able to get a free, fair education on the basis of just being a human living in this area rather than, being a rich boy from Athens, which is good. But the problem still remains. If a society is built on that kind of tiered structure where only the people at the top, and top understood relatively, are able to get the kind of training that will lead them to be morally excellent, is that a good society? This is the big critique of Aristotle. Is that society actually able to communicate to people what it means to truly be morally excellent? Or is even that notion of excellence itself deeply suspect, right? To put it in Among Us terms, is your society sus? Probably. I mean, I would say our society right now is sus in the United States. If you look at a certain number of metrics, right? If you look at the life expectancy, infant mortality rates, poverty, child hunger, food deserts, you look at the toll that climate change is having, we might be suspicious that the way that our society is structured is so much better than the type of society that ancient Athens was, or that any number of other societies were. This is not me saying everything is terrible. This is me saying Aristotle doesn't give us the tools right off the bat to critique that social structure that is deeply stratified and gives benefit to some at the expense of denying that benefit to others. There are a lot of societies historically that are like this. This kind of ethical favoritism seeps into other areas. And so I want to bring in a different kind of critique in a roundabout way. So I've got my W.E.B. DuBois here. This is just like all of his writings. But in The Souls of Black Folk, which is probably his most famous work, although his work on Black Reconstruction and other stuff, his study of Philadelphia is fascinating. Du Bois is, I would say, the most important American sociologist, and I would also argue is an essential American philosopher of culture, society, and racism. But in The Souls of Black Folk, he asks this question, and he's not even asking the question. He's relaying an encounter that he will have with people who are saying things like, "Oh, isn't it so horrible what's happening in this area of the country?" Right? Specifically in the southeastern United States. And they would say to him, usually a white person saying to Du Bois, who is a black man, "Dr. Du Bois, how does it feel to be a problem?" And then go on to talk about other things. And Du Bois says in this passage, I would respond. Sometimes I would try to calm them down. He uses the phrase to go from boiling to a simmer. But to the question, how does it feel to be a problem, I seldom give them a response. And I want to unpack this for a moment. I'm not a Du Bois scholar, but I think that it's interesting to take what Du Bois is implying with this question and put it into conversation with this Aristotelian notion that one's culture and society provides formation, moral formation, for its citizens, but specifically for the elites of that society. What does it mean? How does it feel to be a problem? Frames Du Bois, a black man, as though he, on the basis of being a black man, is viewed as a problem. The society as a whole, the social arrangement, the allowances for certain types of behavior, the licensing, right? The giving the license to act in certain ways of certain types of hateful and violent behavior are not the problem. Instead, the question frames Du Bois, and by extension, black Americans, as the problem. And I think that this is interesting to put into conversation with Aristotle, because Aristotle doesn't necessarily do well when he's talking about outliers. He wants to dismiss them. All right? So in a later book of Aristotle, I believe it's in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he gives a kind of typology of the different sort of moral character that people might have. And those who act in beastly ways, those who act in like intentionally ignorant ways, those who act out of a voluntary selfishness or a voluntary disregard of others. You just dismiss them. There's no talking to them. They can't be redeemed, right? And if we pause and think about this within the material context that Du Bois is is raising this question and bringing up this point about people being a problem and certain groups of people being viewed as a problem, we begin to see something that is, I think, really poignant and really important, but also troubling for Aristotle to wrestle with. I don't think that Aristotle has a good answer for it. And that's not to say that we should just dismiss Aristotle's thought then, but is to say, hey, Aristotle does not have a good answer for this, and therefore is insufficient as a total ethics that we should just buy into hook, line, and sinker. Instead, what we have is somebody who, in Aristotle, can't account for those who would, using the same reasoning that Aristotle has, designate certain people, certain groups of people on the basis of their racial classification, on the basis of their group identity, on the basis of nationality, on the basis of their citizenship status, on the basis of their gender or sexual orientation, to designate them as fully dismissible, as a problem, because it assumes it's all good for us. You're the outlier. You're the one who is wrong. And maybe we can excuse certain behavior, but not all behavior. Many thinkers afterwards who were following in the tradition of DuBois, who were following in the tradition of wrestling with Aristotle's thought, bring this point up. And they get very specific about it. Certain types of behavior against these groups that I mentioned are licensed by a society. They are given not just an allowance, but they are given encouragement, incentive, and authority to be carried out. Because for whatever reason, certain people are designated as not able to be redeemed, not able to be, and redeemed is an anachronism. It culturally doesn't make sense for Aristotle because it's a later notion. Christianity emerges, this idea of redemption that largely stems from Christianity emerges later in history. It's not even on Aristotle's radar. But the idea that maybe rehabilitation, rehabituation, re-education, reformation, in terms of a moral reformation, it's not possible for certain folks. And I think that this is one of the things, oddly enough, and it's going to sound weird because I'll explain it next week. Oddly enough, this is one of the things that is going to bug Kant. Because for Kant, if you are basing your ethics in your society, in moral examples, in happiness, and what you do for happiness, how could that be ethical? How can that be moral? It's just etiquette. It's just what you do around here. How can that actually be ethical? Either a thing is ethical and we have to do it, or it's not. And this kind of, oh, I'm very flexible. I can, be more courageous over here. I can be less courageous over here. Isn't it great to be flexible thing is for Kant utterly useless. Cool. You basically are unethical and are either acting out of what makes you happy or what you are sort of culturally inclined to adhere to. You're not conforming to the moral law. You're conforming to your idea of what morality is based on where you grew up. Which brings me to the sort of last bit of this critique, and then we'll jump into questions. And the last bit of critique is, I would argue, kind of both a positive and a negative critique of Aristotle. I feel like I'm going hard on Aristotle, and this will hopefully be a little bit more even-handed there, because I do really like the way that Aristotle talks about morality. And it specifically is related to this idea of moral formation. For Aristotle, we are shaped, we are guided by how we are formed, and how we're formed, how we're developed, right, is largely informed by our society, by the values that the places we grew up and the people we grew up around, and the ruling ideas of a day were. And on the one hand, that can be really bad if you are, say, a person who is deemed unworthy of rehabilitation, or you are deemed incapable of getting the kind of moral formation necessary to be ethical through the procurement of the appropriate kinds of external goods, let alone internal goods. And so there's a reading of this, I'm calling it an anti-colonial reading, that takes that scenario and says, okay, on the one hand, it's great that this is limited, right? That Aristotle is actually limiting ethics to that kind of cultural milieu that you find yourself in. Your morals and your morality and your ruling ideas and your values are all shaped by a particular area and setting. And that's great because it means that you don't have to know everything. And you don't have to assume that everyone is going to be like you. In fact, it's easier and probably more wise to assume that other people are going to be different. And if other people are different and their morality is shaped by how they were formed, then you don't have really a place to be judgmental. You have a place to be curious. You have incentive to inquire to other folks about what they think is moral and what they think the right thing to do is. And in that sense, you're not only building a relationship with another person, you're actually building a kind of moral conversation, a cross-cultural moral conversation that can lead to some really interesting ways of thinking about morality. And that kind of provincial understanding of morality prevents it from being a kind of imperial idea of morality, which would go out and say, no, we've got morality on lock, and everybody else just has to get on board, and so we're going to set up all of the educational apparatus everywhere we can to be, all of those apparatuses to be based on the way that we do what we do. And so we're going to teach people everywhere to have our morality, even if it doesn't make sense within their particular cultural context. And that tension, I think, doesn't go away with Aristotle. Which isn't to say that Aristotle is not worth reading. I think he's eminently worth reading. And I think that's really important to think about Aristotle within the context of being a human in process, right? That we are not locked in at all in terms of being moral or immoral. Instead, we are capable of getting better. And we can rip Aristotle from his context and take the good and try to mitigate or maybe move on from some of the limitations that were based on what he knew in his time and what his own culture reflected, and we can build on that. We can say we can get better. We can cut people some slack because they are in process, and we can see ourselves as being people who another might think of as their phronimos. And if they might think of us as their moral exemplar, then maybe we should act differently. And maybe we should see ourselves as being a kind of moral exemplar to another, which I think is a cool way to kind of keep ourselves in check and stay humble and recognize that our morality is not necessarily the morality of everyone. But Immanuel Kant might think entirely differently. All right, we're going to jump to questions real quick and then wrap it up. All right, question number 1 is basically related to the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, and that is, what is really going on when Aristotle says that every action aims towards some good? Like, what are the implications of that? I think this is a really good question because Aristotle is making a statement that we would call a metaphysical statement. And a metaphysical statement is a statement about reality. Aristotle is saying that every action that takes place has something that it's aiming towards. And insofar as it is aiming towards something, that action is going to strive towards that goal, that telos, or telos, however you want to say it. So that means a couple of things for Aristotle, and I think there are some implications that we can think about as well. For Aristotle, it means that there is the good of any action. There is the goal or the end of any action, and that even if that action is a step on the way there, it is aiming for that. And so if we know what the end goal of a particular action is, we are able to better understand the nuts and bolts of what's going on and why that action is being pursued. And I think one of the implications that we can think about then is to know that Aristotle would have us think that all actions are trying to achieve something. And it might be the case that somebody might be behaving in a way that seems rather weird to us or maybe off-putting to us. And in reality, they're just trying to achieve a particular goal, and the means by which they are achieving that goal or striving to achieve that goal are just weird to us. This is an experience that I've had a lot. I live in the Midwest. I'm from the East Coast. My family is all like New Yorkers from Brooklyn, so we're very kind of direct, and we will talk over each other, and that's just sort of the way that we roll. And I married into a very quiet, friendly, nice Midwestern family, and it is like being a linguistic wrecking ball. So understanding that somebody engaging in small talk, which to me seems like, all right, like this is just whatever, like why would you engage in small talk? Doesn't make any sense. It's a waste of time and breath, right? It's actually a person using what they are familiar with to try and connect to you. Whereas for me, it would be jumping right into like the meat of a conversation or the like central point of a conversation. Okay, so let's look at the next question. The next question is, why does Aristotle think that some who continuously act selfishly and unjustly in a voluntary manner are incapable of being rehabilitated? I touched on this a little bit before, but I'm going to take a different angle here, and one that I think is really important to think about when engaging with people in the hellscape that is Twitter or any online setting. For Aristotle, if somebody is unwilling to share the same first principles, the same most fundamental assumptions as you, if they are unwilling to engage with you rationally and reasonably, then there's no reason for you, no justification for you to continue to engage with them, because there's no common ground that's going to be achieved. If someone does not believe that you are actually human, or that on the basis of certain aspects of who you are not a person worthy of attention and or respect and dignity, don't argue with them. Don't engage. If you are confronted by people who just want to watch the world burn, and they have clearly demonstrated that this is what they're doing, trolls, there's no reason to engage. Because for Aristotle, that approach does not yield to the kind of redirection and habit formation that can lead to moral ends. That is acting for the sake of something else. It is a deficiency of honesty. It is a lack of sharing a set of common first principles, common metaphysical assumptions about human beings. It's not worth it. Don't waste your breath. Now, in that setting, I think that's okay. But I think in a larger, broader setting, in terms of our everyday encounters with people, Aristotle would say we need to bear in mind that we might not have the capability where we are to genuinely help another person where they are in their life, in their own formation, such that our engagement with them would make the situation worse. That the right thing to do might be to do nothing, or to encourage someone else to engage with them. I know that I'm kind of taking the question and throwing it in a different direction, but I think that it's something that Aristotle gives us as a way of engaging with those who might wish us ill and not wish to actually have a discussion. All right, and finally, what is up with Aristotle dismissing the intellectual virtues? Well, for Aristotle, the intellectual part of the soul, and therefore the excellences of the intellect, are really the kinds of excellences that one can get better at by education. So, for him, it doesn't have to do with action, per se. It has to do with our thinking. So you can get better at thinking and arguing by learning logic, right? And learning the art of arguing. You can get better at speaking persuasively by learning the art of rhetoric. You can become more understanding of the world around you by learning about physics. But none of that has to do with excellence of how you interact with other people or of morality. All of that, you could be a scumbag and still understand how the world works, be persuasive, and understand how arguments function. There are plenty of people who do just that and who are very, very scummy. So, for Aristotle, it's not enough to just know what good is and what the right thing to do is. One has to actually do it, and you do it by practicing and by all those other things. So it's not that the intellectual virtues aren't important. It's that the intellectual virtues are important within their own sphere and not within the sphere or area of human existence that morality is. And that kind of separation is something that we're going to see next week when we talk about Immanuel Kant. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Please feel free to leave questions in the email, and I will see you later. Adios.